Welcome to the Real Estate Syndication Show. Whether you are a seasoned investor or building a new real estate business, this is the show for you. Whitney Sewell talks to top experts in the business. Our goal is to help you master real estate syndication. And now your host, Whitney Sewell.
This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. Today, our guest is Rahul Patel. Thanks for being on the show again, Rahul.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, I know the listeners have heard your name numerous times. He was on show 217 and 294. He's covered many topics in the syndication business that we need to be familiar of, and we're very thankful for your time, Rahul. But a little about him, in case you haven't heard of him. And again, I would encourage you to go back and listen to those episodes. But he's an attorney, licensed MBA agent, real estate developer, professor, speaker, and serial entrepreneur. Is most commonly known as the managing partner of Patel Gaines, the fifth fastest growing law firm in the nation, where he represents over $8.5 billion in commercial property. He's been featured in USA Today, Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, Texas Lawyer, and the Business Journal, where he was named Man of the Year, an Outstanding Lawyer, and a 40 under 40. So thank you again, Rahul. We're grateful for your knowledge and expertise in sharing with us today. But today we're going to cover a very specific thing that's so important in this business, and you know, maybe give the listeners a little update about you or you know, your focus today, and then let's dive right in.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back on the show. You know, if I've been on a few times, it means hopefully you haven't kicked me back off. So I appreciate you having me on. Love being a part of this, and you know, I just love. I kind of want to mention this. I really love the entrepreneurial kind of spirit that's been burgeoning behind the multifamily kind of arena. I haven't seen anything like this. I consider it almost a phenomenon that folks are really telling and sharing and talking about every one of their secrets of how to do what it is that they do. And that's rare, right? I mean, it's really, truly rare. We've seen it a little bit in the residential space, the rehab, but you don't see it very often. People don't like to share how to do things. So I love being a part of your show. I love what you're doing. And just thanks for having me back on. But today we're going to talk a little bit about letter of intent. It's probably an area that gets most commonly glazed over by folks because they're so excited. They're about to get a deal to get together. So it's their first kind of formal bite at making this thing happen, right? So it's an important document, but it's also not legally binding, right? So there's a challenge between those two things of how to make sure that you balance fairness, but also something that will lead to a deal to happen, right?
Yes, very important part of the business. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I feel like also there's many things that people either leave out of their letter of intent, or, you know, or forget to make sure it's certain that's in there. It's not worded correctly, and I'm looking forward to really diving into this with you. And so get us started, you know, and some maybe even things that we need to make certain that's in our letter of intent, or maybe we could even back up and just talk about the letter of intent process a little bit. And things we need to know about, you know, when do we use a letter of intent, why, and, you know, and when does that come about?
Sure. So, you know, I actually have one in front of me. So, you know, they can range anywhere from 1 page to 5 pages. I've seen letter of intents right now with one that we're working on. It's about 20 plus pages, right? So a letter of intent can become it can be very simple. It can become complicated, but most importantly, sometimes it can also lead to complications because you tend to kind of agree to terms just to get things done, and you may not really understand the ramifications of them once you're into an actual contract stage. So typically letter of intent, purchase price, earnest money, how long you have to close, how long a feasibility period or due diligence period you have, and what kind of documents you're going to get during the due diligence period. And those are probably your major concerns that you have. Sometimes an LOI can address certain things like title insurance, surveys, brokers, certain fees and expenses that might be covered or may not be covered. But those are probably your most basic points, and probably about every LOA you're going to see. They're going to at least cover, you know, purchase price, earnest money, closing period, and due diligence. Those are probably your biggest buckets of items that you really need to have in an LOI to substantiate the next process. So,
and how, you know, is the LOI, you know, how legally binding is this?
Well, it's not. So, I mean, it's really not a legally binding contract or document at all. It's like a memorandum of understanding. It's a letter of agreement to kind of move forward. So a lot of folks have different schools of thought, and it comes as the buyer or the seller, but people have different schools of thoughts to LOI. Some folks spend a lot of time on the LOI, a lot. They go back and forth. They go back and forth because what their intent is that the LOI really will then speed up the purchase and sale agreement time, right? So that before they engage their lawyer, they have kind of hashed out majority of the big items, right? Between the buyer and the seller, without having, folks involved, you're able to hash out kind of major items that are really important to you. So the goal is that it speeds up the purchase and sale item. Some folks say, we just want to get into a PSA as quick as possible because the LOI is non-binding. So again, it doesn't mean anything, right? It doesn't have the bearing and the effect that you need. So let's just get past this and get it into the PSA stage. So it's kind of a school of thought, and there's no right or wrong. Again, kind of a lot of what we've talked about in these different episodes is there's no really right or wrong, but it's really about strategy, right? It's really about how you approach things. Sometimes about what kind of team you have in the background. If you've got a very sophisticated build out and a team, and you've got people who've had experience in this transaction side, you'll see more sophisticated 6, 7, 8 page LOIs because their team internally does a lot of that before they call the lawyer and say, hey guys, we have an executed LOI, let's get cracking. Some folks say, well, let's just kind of get this going and then let's get the experts involved very quickly. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah. So that LOI is really laying out the things that are important to us, like you said, and I can see how, it can speed things up. It just lays out some things, helps you to even think through some things that are important to you and why, and sets some expectations as well.
Sure. Absolutely.
So, in this, maybe, I'd love to dive a little deeper and just what we need to include, or maybe common things also that are forgotten about, or maybe things that would even help speed that process up more if we included those things, but maybe they're normally forgotten.
So, okay, so we'll talk about a couple of things. So number one, if you're walking out of a deal, I'll kind of go through these, and they're different deals, but number one, if you've got and we're seeing it more and more now prevalent, people coming out of a defeasance, a 1030 or a 1031. So somebody's got a CMBS loan on it, a commercial mortgage-backed security, or a 1031. There are certain specific timing issues that really come into play. You can't just kick the can down the road or close on a specific day. You've got to have certain trigger points. So you really want to address that if you're coming in or out of one, because that's going to become a critical item and that may affect the buyer or the seller differently, right? So you want to really make sure that you spit that out from the beginning because that could have an impact on another party. And that is a material item that you kind of want to kind of let the buyer or the seller know when you're coming into it because that can effectuate a lot of things. Another really kind of important item that I see, sometimes glanced over is really, I think a strong item, because I said it's not a binding agreement, is taking the property off of the market. So what we typically look to do is put together a provision in there that's a withdrawal of the property from market. And what that does is it allows people to work that property, have that kind of safety net that says while we work from this, that nobody just takes that property away from them, right? They can't just pull it out from market, another better deal comes in, and execute a PSA and go. So usually what happens is you can do a tight window where the property is then not marketable, and then that kind of creates a binding effect on that or a non-binding effect on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great idea. So that would be in our LOI, just saying that, from this time to this time or during this process, property's off the market.
Correct. Right. So that way allows the buyer to do a little bit of work because they have to contact some folks. Same thing with the seller, but it gives you some assurances. Another couple kind of items you really want to do is, certain things like conditions of closing. A lot of times there are things that could affect title that you want to address that'll be addressed in the PSA. But you can, if you become experienced at this, or you've got a really good experienced attorney, a lot of times what you can do is you can pull very common phrases and terms from a PSA and put them into the contract, into the LOI, because what that'll do is it allows you to save time and money in the PSA stage, and it gets you to understand what you're going to be required of when you go into PSA. So that's another one, is conditions of closing, whether it's going to be an as is, what kind of title you're going to get, what kind of endorsements you might want to get, certain things like that. Who's responsible for the contract is another one, because sometimes you may want to, some folks, you would think, well, does that matter? It does. Some folks are in the acquisition mode, significantly, and they really want to make sure that they have a contract that they feel comfortable with. It saves them time, money. And sometimes the seller says, nope, this is my contract. This is my attorney. I'm going to dictate the terms. And you'll be surprised how many times that can slow down a deal unknowingly, right? So that's another kind of item. You know, what I always say, another really important one is closing. And so folks we talked about this, I think, in one of your other podcasts that we did, was that closing, it's such a hot market right now that people are using their ability to close as a principal kind of carrot. Says, look, I'm offering 9.5, he's offering 9.5, but I'll close in 60 days, he'll close in 90 days. And so you come out of the gate with that, and then they don't have that ability to close. So what I always say is, you know, having hard extensions are really a good way to dictate to both sides that, look, we might need more time, but by virtue of needing more time, we are fully committed. We're going to put an extra $200,000 of hard money for the extra 30 days, another $500,000 for the extra 30 days. Because if you're already going to go through the purchase, you know what you need. You just have a couple of timing issues on the back end. That obviously is a risk for you because you may not close, but it lets you hang on to a property that the other folk came out with a quicker close, but you were able to extend that, but knowing that you got the time to get your deal done. So another one is, go ahead.
So you mean adding those extensions or the expected extensions into your LOI, that would be included in the purchase and sale agreement?
Yeah, because sometimes what happens is you kind of dictate that, but then what happens is you get into the PSA stage, and then you start negotiating there, and it's like, no. You agreed to 60-day close. You signed it. Now you want 90? Not going to happen. And so what happens, things fall apart. And why I say that is some folks take the model of the LOI saying, well, it's okay. Let's just get ink and get a contract going, and we'll negotiate everything later. And some folks, it depends, will really hold you to an LOI. And so your ability to negotiate anything after the fact becomes very difficult as an attorney. And now you're either stuck with those terms as a buyer or a seller, or you have to pass on a deal by virtue of something because they believe that you now are retrading the original agreement. Does that make sense?
It does.
You really want to be careful because it's sometimes and there are a lot of sensitivities to that because you're working through middlemen now. So you have a broker kind of saying, well, they agreed to 60, but now they want 90. And it's like, well, no, they don't want 90. They want 60, but they're paying for the next 30. But they say, no. I made plans to close on December 31st. Right? I got other things that I'm going to do with my money. So now they want January 30th. That doesn't work for me. Does that make sense?
It does.
So really being transparent kind of at the beginning and the onset is important, if that makes sense. And then earnest money. Earnest money is another one where there are a lot of ways to play earnest money. And in terms of sometimes earnest money can be immediately released. Sometimes it can be released at certain periods like expiration of due diligence or feasibility. And sometimes earnest money just sits in the account until closing. And that may seem like, well, does it really matter? It does, especially if there's a dispute. If the money's sitting in title, it's sitting in title. If the money's sitting in the seller's hands, it's sitting in the seller's hands, right? So it does matter. And those are things that sometimes you just put $100,000 earnest money deposited 30 days after close. Well, let's address whether it needs to be immediately released at expiration or if it just stays in the escrow account through closing. So
Great
those are
point.
major topics in an LOI, in my opinion, that come up quite a bit.
So what about the wording of each of these things? I know you've addressed many things here that we definitely need to think about.
Sure.
But should we consider hiring an attorney for every LOI, or if we're doing a $20 million deal, I hope my attorney's involved.
Sure.
If we're buying $30,000 single family homes every day, well, guys are printing them off. Just finding one online and updating it a little bit and using it, fine. But doing large commercial deals like this, should we have our attorney look at every LOI?
So here's what we do, where I recommend most folks, especially if you're in what I call kind of the rinse and repeat. If this is not a one-time deal for you, and if you're going to acquire your first deal, first time ever, you're going to need an attorney involved with you in general, right? Because first time, if you're going to go through this, you should have somebody guiding you through this. Now, as you go through this and you're going to get a practice of this, what I always believe is that your attorney and you have two different things. One is protecting your legal interests, and one is helping you set the business principles of how you operate. So what we do, we have a client right now, the kind of LOI that's on my desk right now. They have acquired probably about 24 assets in the last, 12 months or so, right? Average price, 30 million, 40 million. And so what we've done is we sat down and really carve out a good LOI that works for their business practice, right? And also works for our legal practice. And that's where they start from. They may make some modifications with or without us, but we have an LOI that we feel good about and they feel good about. And the reason why what I say about that is there are certain things that come back and we say, well, look, I want you to, when you hire a lawyer, you want the lawyer to protect your interests. But when I say, well, you sign this and this has this effect, well, I didn't know that. Well, now I got to work with this as confines. And that always hurts the credibility of you in negotiating with the other lawyer, because the lawyer has that leverage and says, no, your guy signed this. So, I mean, you don't want to go back and say, well, he didn't really know, he didn't understand, we didn't have a chance to talk about it. So what that does is what I call, if you look at this, I got like I said, a 7-page LOI in front of me. There's probably about 50% business, 50% legal. So we help tweak the legal items and kind of here's why, and we start with that form. And so before they start negotiating things away, and because they've gotten experience in it, they know what that Section 3 due diligence is. So they know what they can give on and what they can't give on without ruining the back-end legal item that might have to come up with it. But something perhaps like confidentiality agreement or an assignment provision, they might come to us and say, hey, before I tweak this, let me run it past you. But usually what happens is the LOI is usually a business-facing deal between the two business folks, and the lawyers sometimes are working in the background. So I always say, if it's your first deal, get a lawyer involved. If you're going to be doing this multiple times, then make sure that you have got a good attorney that's matched your business principles with your legal principles, so you're advancing with a uniform document.
So, in this business, obviously we're working with an SEC attorney, securities attorney. Is it the same attorney that we should have, is that the same attorney that we should have looking over our LOI or helping us draft that document as well?
Well, so you got two different folks. You got one who's just a simple, who's helping you with the transaction side of it, and then one who's helping you with the syndicate side, right? Who's helping you raise the money, helping you put your LP documents all together. Typically depending on where you are, who you're working with, right? The scale. So a $2 million acquisition transaction, that attorney, depending on who they are, may or may not be able to handle both aspects of it, okay? Transactional side of it's fairly simple. Now, again, I use that with caveat because a $5 million transaction can be as complicated as a $50 million deal, but it's usually, you usually have some cross with. So for someone like us or for our firm, we handle both sides of that transaction because they go hand in hand. Because once you get to the PSA stage and you know that you're going to be buying this, there are things that you agree to within that and the structure or the assignment and how the funding comes into play. And so having multiple attorneys there can become complicated then too at the same time, because now one hand may not understand what the other hand's doing or why they're doing it, right? So having somebody who can handle a multifamily transaction that handles both of those aspects if they're needed will help you a lot. And overall, actually, it'll just help you save money because you're not having two lawyers having communicated with each other and say, well, why are you doing that? Well, my document tells me I have to do that. Well, that's just not possible. So then you go back and forth a lot. Does that make sense?
It does.
Earning a lot of money going back and forth with each other.
Yeah. So, and you had mentioned that like the LOI can also lead to some complications and, what are some complications or maybe that we hadn't talked about that the LOI could lead to, or are there times that we should not, submit an LOI?
Number one, agreeing to something that you don't agree with just to get an LOI done. I see that a lot. I'll be honest with you. I see it a lot and I'm seeing it more and more because there's such a rush to get deals. And so even though it's not a binding agreement, it does dictate to who you are. And so it is a small community. It's a big community, but it is a small community. So you have a reputation. You could build yourself a reputation to get an LOI means nothing to one another. So it's the same deal as a handshake. Whitney, if I shake your hand and say, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this podcast for you today. We have no binding agreement that I show up today, right? But if I don't show up, what does that say to you in the future when you've got a podcast with me? Does that make sense? And so in the same situation here with the IFC folks who say, well, it doesn't matter. Just an LOI. I just had to get it done. Now go back and retrade it. And so that can be, it's done all the time because you say, well, that's an LOI. We didn't really understand. The PSA is a different stage now. So we'll go back and forth and haggle that all the time. But my philosophy is if you can't agree to it, then don't agree to it, because now you're setting yourself up to backtrack. And a lot of times you can lose the deal that way, even though you got the deal, but you lost it by lack of transparency. So my number one belief, if you're not getting in trouble with the LOI, is don't agree to something that you can't agree to, right? And fundamentally. And that will make your job, that will make your attorney's job easier. It'll cost you less money because you're not trying to change terms around. And so that kind of stems across the board on any section. It's really a global saying that can apply to any section that you have. If you can't agree to it, don't agree to it, the LOI.
Now, your word is extremely important in any business, and this business is no different. And that LOI is just an extension of your word, and of you doing what you're saying you're going to do. Yep, absolutely, and it helps a lot, because then what happens is a lot of times when you do need a tweak or you need to adjust some things, you haven't changed term after term after term. So then the fifth time you need something, they're going to say no. Instead, it's the first time you've needed to ask for something. Yeah. Yeah. So, through this LOI process, any other complications, any other things that stand out to you that you see are trouble that people are having, or things that we need to be aware of? Yeah. A lot of times things like, assignment provisions can become an issue too. A lot of times what happens is there's really either no provision about assignment put in there, and then we start to deal with that. So a lot of times, for example, I'm going to read one real quick. Purchaser may, on or before closing date, assign its rights and obligations here under the contract to any entity in which purchaser or its name has an interest, or in any other affiliate of purchaser with prior written consent, which consent shall not be reasonably withheld. So you can either do it as kind of friendly as that. You can just say you're going to assign it, or and so that comes up quite a bit, because the entity in which you sign the contract under, or the LOI under, or even the PSA may not end up being the actual entity that buys it. We talked about that a little bit, about the entity, right? Like, do we form the entity? How do we do it? When's the right time? So this is another one of those, whereas you haven't formed your entity yet. Now what? Well, the chicken and the egg we talked about, same situation. What if you form the entity, but you don't know if that's going to be the one? So that's another provision that you really want them to know, because what's happening now is people are retrading deals, right? It's such a hot item that there are people who are putting them under contract, finding a different LP or a different structure, and they're selling it, right? Making a quick flip on it, basically flipping the paper. And so what you want to really do is make sure that if you have some intent there to do something like that, you don't need to tell them, but you do need to make sure that you have the ability to effectuate the goal that you want to do. Does that make sense? Yes. So that you're not saying one thing and then planning to do something different. Right, because then you may not be able to do it. So that's one. Again, I'll tell you, the 1031 item is an important one, because there's cooperations that have to happen between the buyer and the seller to make it happen timely, properly. Make sure that if you're coming in with some sort of structure like that, let them know. Because the way I look at this is, typically, if you let them know what you're doing on your end, it lets them know what's going on and why you need an extra XYZ days, or why you're asking them to submit such and such, because the other side has an idea of what's going on. And if you let them know in this commercial transaction, most folks are savvy enough to understand what's happening. So my feeling is let them know. Don't hide that. That fears, that certain things like defeasance and 1031 can concern some folks and say, oh, well, what's going to happen over there? But I think, more often than not, when you come out of the gate, let them know what you're doing. It works to your advantage. Yeah, and just being transparent about all those little things up front shows you're organized, shows you're being upfront with them. I think it goes a long way through the entire process, and even just them working with you on other issues that come up. Yep, absolutely. So, LOIs is definitely it's a part of the transaction process. We have to become familiar with. We have to be good at, and it's great to have somebody like you on the team that can help us to make certain that we're stating that we're going to do things that we can actually agree to, like you said. And before we have to go, anything else about the LOI process that you definitely want people to know about? My philosophy here, or last kind of parting words, is think it through. At the same time, don't overthink it too. I know that sounds kind of
well, Rahul, which one are you saying? But at the same time, think it through, make sure you have the provisions that matter to you, make sure you understand what you're signing. But at some point, again, it's not the binding document. So if there are things that are not in there, well, then you can address them at the PSA stage, right? If there are things that are just like, well, it doesn't say anything about this. Well, if it doesn't say anything about it, it will be addressed, assure you, at the PSA stage. If it's something that's important enough to you, then that you need to put it in there, then go ahead and work it through. Some folks can, what I would call beat an LOI to death, where they just go back and forth with so much that the deal never happens. So you can turn a buyer or seller off. But so what I would say is know your audience. So what I say is, if you're the buyer, know who your seller is, know how they operate. Because if they're a handshake person, work things out. They don't worry about what the document says. Let's figure this stuff out. Well, that'll help you, knowing that there's some things in there that you need to work through. Now, if you have a buyer or a seller that if they say, if it says A, they're going to hold you to A, well, then you better make sure it's what you want, right? So know your audience in that same respect when you're going into it. Do your homework, ask the broker the questions about the LOI. And so that will tell you a lot, if that makes sense, right? So really know your audience before you go into it. And that can help you dictate how aggressive you need to be with the LOI, or whether you can enter into it with a 2-page LOI and get to the PSA stage.
I like that. I haven't heard that talked about knowing your audience, knowing the seller, knowing the other person you're going into this agreement with.
Yep.
So, Rahul, before we have to go, how do you like to give back?
How do I like to give back?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so at Patel Gaines, we've been really involved with the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. So the LLS Society has been huge to us. I got involved with it about 5 years ago. It's a fight for blood cancer, and it's incredible to see how it's indiscriminate to who it affects. I mean, it affects children, husbands, fathers, wives, mothers, everybody. And so it's something that we haven't been able to find a cure for. And it's been a cause that's been important to us as a firm, and for me and my law partner as well. So we love to find ways to give back to the LLS and the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. And fortunately, we don't have somebody directly who's been affected by that, but that's exactly our goal, is that we don't know anybody that's ever been affected by it. So.
No, I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Rahul. Appreciate your time today and just sharing your expertise and going through this LOI process and things that are commonly forgotten, or why this document's very important, and that we're very transparent and that we understand it. It's an agreement, even though it's not legally binding. It's your word. And so, thank you for elaborating on that. Tell the listeners how they can get in touch with you and learn more about you.
Sure. Well, you can find us on all social media outlets, but our website's www.patelgaines.com, and that's PATELGAINES.com. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn as well. But if you ever need anything, you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us via email. And our email, the best email address is info@patelgaines.com. Happy to help. Wish you the best of luck if you're listening, and don't be afraid. I mean, the LOI is an important stage, but if you can get an LOI going and turn it over to your team and of your attorneys to help you out, you'll be well on your way to your deal.
Thank you for listening to the Real Estate Syndication Show, brought to you by Life Bridge Capital. Life Bridge Capital works with investors nationwide to invest in real estate, while also donating 50% of its profits to assist parents who are committing to adoption. Life Bridge Capital, making a difference, one investor and one child at a time. Connect online at www.lifebridgecapital.com for free material and videos to further your success.